Hey guys, how we doing? Let me turn this down. Sorry, it took me a few minutes to get online. It's telling me my resolution's not very good tonight, so I don't know if that has something to do with the wind or what, but I tried to adjust it, so we'll see how that goes. But anyway, let me get back to this screen. Getting ready to do the live review right now. Like I said today in class, I'm going to try to do this as quick as I can just because there's just so much information on this unit that I want to get through it as quickly as I can so I can then be open to any questions that you have. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Does anybody have any questions before I do start? Something you want me to key in on, or any particular topics that you want more information on? Because otherwise the plan is just to go full board and knock it out. So I'll give everybody just a couple more minutes. Looks like we got about 20 people in here now. I might have bumped some people off when I reset the resolution. So if that happens, yeah, here comes a few more. So all right, I'm not seeing any questions coming in right now. Let me scroll down here. I got a couple things going on. Too many screens going at once, so I'm sorry about that. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do, just so you know, is I am going to literally just work by going through the PowerPoint here. Let me adjust this here a little bit. I definitely going to go over the Compromise of 1850, Maddie and Kim. I am going to, the reform movements, Kim, they're not a major part of the test, but they are going to be on the test. And I think what I had up on the board this morning in class, the abolition movement, the suffrage movement, and the temperance movement are probably the big reform movements that you need to know. I really don't have, why don't I just start with the reform movements, because I want to knock those out pretty quickly, because I don't think they're like a major part, but you do need to have a working knowledge of them. And of course, the reform movement started with the Second Great Awakening. And we compared the Second Great Awakening to the First Great Awakening. And the major difference, you still had the fire and brimstone preachers, you still had the traveling preachers, the itinerant preachers, and stuff like that. But the biggest difference was the basis of the belief system. And if you remember correctly, the First Great Awakening, they had a Calvinistic belief or predestination, where in the Second Great Awakening, it's more of a you can choose your salvation or not. And so that's going to be the primary difference between the two. And the Second Great Awakening is basically going to lead into the reform movements. It's going to inspire the reform movements. And the idea behind the Second Great Awakening is we want to make society better. And one person can make a difference, and individuals can affect the morality of society, if you will. And some of the key areas they were looking at, like I said, was abolition, which was the work towards ending slavery. Temperance, which was the idea that they wanted to ban alcohol because they saw alcohol as the evil in society. And then, of course, women's suffrage is the other major reform movement. That's not all the reform movements at the time. You also had education reform. You had the prison and mental health reform as well. And so these are all kind of tied together, because what you're going to find is a lot of the leaders in each individual reform movement crossed over and worked in other reform movements. For instance, in women's suffrage, you had Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. They're working primarily for women's suffrage, but what we're going to find, honestly, when we get into the 1860s, is they're going to work against slavery with the society they formed during the Civil War. So, they're going to fight for abolition too. William Lloyd Garrison, who wrote The Liberator, the newspaper for the abolition of slaves, and his whole focus was in banning slavery in our country. And he is actually going to, work with some of the women in other areas as well. Frederick Douglass, who was part of the abolition movement, is actually going to be at the Seneca Falls Convention with fighting for women's suffrage. So you can see that all of these reformers are going to work together on their different reforms. Now, like I said, the abolition movement, that's all about the banish of slavery in our country, is led by William Lloyd Garrison. And he was the most radical because they wanted the immediate end of slavery. It wasn't about, a gradual emancipation or working with an American colonization society or anything like that. They wanted to end slavery now and get the newly freed slaves into society. Frederick Douglass, also, the former slave, he is going to work for abolition. He's going to speak on behalf of the abolition movement, not only here in the United States, but overseas as well. He'll have his own newspaper called the North Star, also another abolition newspaper. Women involved in the abolition movement include the Grimke sisters. You also have, the temperance movement going on in this time. Temperance movement was about banning alcohol, and if you remember, we did that cartoon. I know you did it in your notebook, and we went over it in class. Alcohol was seen as the mortal, I guess the evil of all society, and that just one drink could lead a man to ruin if that first drink. So they were working towards banning alcohol, and they were successful to a point. Maine is going to be the first state to ban alcohol. We looked at some of the different laws they had in place, and I think we talked about the 15-gallon law that was put in place for about a year, I think in Massachusetts, and that's where they said you could buy alcohol, but you can only buy it in 15-gallon increments, and so that way really only the wealthy elite could afford it, and it was seen that they could handle it. But what they were trying to do is they were trying to put the bars out of business and the saloons. And so what they thought was if you couldn't go in and buy, you're not going to go into a bar and sit and buy 15 gallons of alcohol. But we talked about how they, got around that. I mean, one of the most famous ways they got around that law was the striped pig show. And I talked about that, how they painted a pig with pinstripes on a pig, and then they would sell tickets to see the pig, and you get free alcohol as part of your ticket purchase. So that kind of stuff went on. And then finally, the women's suffrage movement. And the big thing you need to know about that is the year 1848. 1848 is the Seneca Falls Convention, and that's when you have over 90 men and women come together, and they're going to draft the Declaration of Sentiments. And what that is that's the women's, Declaration of Independence and their desire to move towards political involvement and, most importantly, the vote. And so all of that is going on. It kind of gets started, at the end of the Second Great Awakening, which, really started in the 1810s, 1820s, and it will, evolve from there. And so these reform movements are going to be taking place, in the 1830s, going into the 1840s, and into the 1850s, which is kind of where we're going to pick up our discussion of going into the Civil War. Now, I gave you guys this timeline here, and I had you fill it out in class, and these were the key dates that were important to the road to the Civil War. And as we look at that, it's just, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Obviously, what this does is this is the beginning of expansion of America. And so the first question we have to ask with ourselves is when we get to 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, how are we going to allow for the expansion of slavery? And as you remember, the Missouri Compromise allowed Missouri to come in as a slave state, but balance that out with Maine coming in as a free state. And for future, territories coming in, they're going to set the 3630 line, which says every state that comes in north of that line will be a free state. Every state that comes in south of that line is going to be a slave state. Basically, what we see there is that they're trying to set up a system that will last. Now, you got to remember in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, our country only went about as far as the Rocky Mountains or the extent of the original Louisiana Purchase. So they thought with this 3630 line, that's going to take care of the situation. They're not going to have to worry about it anymore. 1836 is going to be the next big year you should be familiar with. In Congress, what they're going to do is they're going to pass the gag rule, and that's basically, says we're not going to have any discussions or we're not going to listen to any petitions regarding the ending of slavery in our country. And they basically just gagged the congressman and said we're not talking about it. The other thing that happened in 1836 is Texas is going to gain its independence from Mexico. And Initially, Texas wanted to come into the United States, but Andrew Jackson said no because of the fact that Texas would have been a slave state, and that would have upset the balance in the Senate. And you got to remember that the majority of debate with regards to the expansion of slavery dealt with this idea that we have to maintain a balance between free and slave states in the Senate. And so a lot of times these debates is not about abolition or about the morality of slavery. It was about the power in the government. And so when Jackson said no to Texas, he was avoiding another big debate about slavery because Texas coming in would have upset the balance. Now, Texas does eventually become a state, which will be in 1845. They're going to come in. It's going to be John Tyler who signs Texas in as a state, but it will be James K. Polk who will take credit for it. And if you remember correctly, James K. Polk was elected 1844 to 1848, and he is elected on the idea of completing manifest destiny in our country. And so, he promised he'd bring Texas in. He promised he'd extend the United States to the western border, and he promised that he'd get Oregon and wrestle that away from Great Britain. At the time, we shared the territory of Oregon with Great Britain, and if you remember, Polk's campaign promise was 54-40 or fight. He was going to have, get Oregon, the Oregon Territory from Great Britain up to the 54th parallel, or he said he was willing to go to war and fight for it. That's not going to happen. We're going to negotiate with Great Britain. It's going to come down to the 49th parallel, but we will get the Oregon Territory. Texas is going to come in, but that's going to lead us to our next big date, which is 1846 to 48, which is the Mexican-American War. Now, a lot of people argued that we did not have the right to go to war with Mexico. In fact, Abraham Lincoln was a congressman at this point, and he is going to oppose the Mexican War. In fact, he's going to ask for the spot resolution, where he said, I want to know the exact spot that American blood was spilled to justify this war. A lot of people are upset that Polk sent troops down to Texas across the Nueces River without congressional approval. In the end, though, we do win the Mexican War, and as a result, we get the Mexican ceded territory. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. 1850, we are going to talk about the Compromise of 1850 in detail, just not on this slide. 1850s are very important. You need to remember, these dates, and the best way to remember it is going by, even number years. 1852, you're going to see Uncle Tom's Cabin. 1854, we're going to look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act. 1856, that's when we're at the height of Bleeding Kansas. 1857, we're going to the odd-numbered years now. You're going to see the Dred Scott case. 1858, that's going to be the Lincoln-Douglas debates that were spurred by the Dred Scott case. 1859, things are going to start heating up as we have the Harper's Ferry raid led by John Brown. And then, of course, 1860 will be the election of Lincoln as President of the United States, and that's going to lead to the secession of South Carolina and the beginning of the Civil War. Now, some of these things I want to talk about a little bit more in detail, starting with the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Compromise of 1850, it dealt with this idea of what are we going to do with the Mexican ceded land. We just got this huge plot of land from Mexico, and the debate once again comes up. Should we allow slavery or not? Now, if we extended the 3630 line, you can kind of see in the map there on the top left, that would have been the obvious answer. Let's just extend that line, continue with what we have with the Missouri Compromise. The big problem with that is that's going to divide California in half. And most Northerners wanted to see California come in as a free state. As it said in the video today, that was 100,000 people living there, and that population would have an effect on representation within the House of Representatives. So, but, on the same token, the South wanted California to come in as a slave state. So we have, we have this debate going on. We have the southern states, once again, South Carolina threatening to secede at that point. And this is going to be Henry Clay's big last hurrah, because Henry Clay is going to come up with the Compromise of 1850. And remember, there's 5 key parts to the Compromise of 1850. The first part is going to be that California absolutely comes in as a free state. That is for the North. That's what they did for the northern states. For the southern states, they kind of did 2 things. They said that in the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, which is that ceded land, they would allow popular sovereignty to determine whether or not states in that region would be slave or free. So the people would decide there. And what I said, I think, in class was Congress pretty much just passed the buck on that one. They didn't come up with a decision, so they said, all right, we'll just make it popular sovereignty. The other thing the South got was a stronger fugitive slave law. We had a fugitive slave law in effect at this point. There's been one in effect since the 1790s. This one just strengthens it. This one gets support from the federal government. And what we're seeing now is slave catchers can go into the North. They can hunt down slaves. Slaves are put on trial. When they're captured, they're taken to a judge. They're not given a jury trial. They're given a bench trial where a judge is going to have to listen to them to hear whether or not they are a slave or they are a free man. And I mentioned in class that bounties were paid for capturing slaves. So there was a lot of corruption with the judges and stuff. Due to this, the corruption and what was going on with the fugitive slave law and these bench trials and everything, you're going to see some states pass what were called personal liberty laws. Wisconsin was one of the first. And what these personal liberty laws said was that basically they were going to guarantee jury trials for those who were captured and wanted to be sent back into slavery. So they're going to receive a jury trial. The other thing that Wisconsin and other states who passed these personal liberty laws refused to do, they refused to allow the federal government to use their jails to house these so-called captured slaves. So you are going to see some pushback to the fugitive slave law. It's going to cause a lot of conflict throughout the North and everything like that. And it's going to cause, we saw the video today, it's going to cause a lot of conflict for the president as well. Why weren't there any riots and mini wars in New Mexico? And honestly, Ishan, the population was low. There weren't a lot of people living out there at the time. When what we saw in Kansas, which I'll talk about in a minute, is you had people moving there already with their slaves and already establishing the territory as a slave state. That didn't happen in New Mexico and Utah because there wasn't a need, I guess, for slaves at this point, and they hadn't established their territory where they had reached statehood yet. And remember, with Kansas and Nebraska, they were about to, they were a territory about to apply for statehood with different constitutions. And so they were on the crux of statehood. And so that's why that one was, much more heated. Whereas New Mexico and Utah, they didn't have nearly enough people to even start talking about statehood yet. So that's why you're not going to see any problems out there at this point. So hopefully that answers your question. So I got the fugitive slave law. I have California's free state popular sovereignty. The other thing that's going to happen with the Compromise of 1850 is they're going to end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. is smack in the middle of the southern states. And so slaves in Washington, D.C. was common, and that's not going to go away. But what's going to end is slave auctions in Washington, D.C. So that's part of the compromise as well. And finally, the last part of the Compromise of 1850 is it's going to be an exchange of land for money. That red area on that lower left map, that has been area that was claimed by Texas. And so what we're going to see is Texas is going to cede that land to the United States, and in exchange, they're going to get money to pay off their war debt. Okay, so that's the Compromise of 1850, and that's what was supposed to basically settle this slavery question once and for all. but then, I was glad it came up in the video today, because this was something that I left out in class in our discussions, and that's going to be what happened with the Transcontinental Railroad. There was this, I mean, remember we talked about the Gadsden Purchase, and Jefferson Davis had negotiated purchasing that land from Mexico in order to build that southern route on the railroad. And the idea was that the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, was going to go through that territory in Gadsden and go up and end up in Los Angeles. But the North wanted the railroad too. And the North, like it said in the video, it was going to go from Chicago all the way to San Francisco. And so you have this debate of which route would be built. So this is when Stephen Douglas is going to jump in, and he is going to basically negotiate, trying to, get the northern route built. And in order to get the northern route built, he was going to have to get Southern congressmen to support that. And the way he's going to do that is with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, things were already heating up in our country, because previous to the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe had published Uncle Tom's Cabin, and we talked in depth about how this book put a human face on slavery, and a lot of people really started turning towards that moral question of whether or not we wanted slavery in our country, because now they have a human element to it, and they can relate to the story. And so you're going to see anti-slavery movements starting to kind of heat up in the North, and it's not like on the cusp of war or anything with the book, but it definitely started the discussion, which was very instrumental to leading to the war. Now, in 1854, Stephen Douglas from Illinois, he's trying to get that Transcontinental Railroad passed. He's trying to get it to go across the northern part of the country, which means it's going to start in Chicago, Illinois. That's going to be money coming into his state. So he is going to write the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This is going to be kind of a negotiation with southern states to support the northern route. And he's going to say, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, we're going to nullify the Missouri Compromise. What we're going to do is we're going to offer popular sovereignty in Kansas. We're going to let the people of Kansas determine whether or not they want slaves. This is going to cause a huge uproar between the Free Soilers and the pro-slavery movement. And the pro-slavery movement, you're going to see a lot of these what we call border ruffians coming across the border and, trying to, I guess, stuff the ballot box, if you will, as the vote for slavery goes on. And we're going to see... I'm sorry, wrong PowerPoint. We're going to see, this is going to be the introduction of Beecher Bibles on the, being sent to the Free Soilers or the anti-slavery movements and stuff. And we're going to see Kansas become a preview of the Civil War. It's going to, it's going to be referred to as Bleeding Kansas. We know like about 55 people were killed, 56 people were killed. One of the first conflicts of Bleeding Kansas is going to be the Potawatomi Massacre. That's going to be led by John Brown, where he and his son kill 5 pro-slavery advocates. You're going to see 2 different constitutions come out of Kansas. You're going to have the Lecompton Constitution, which was a pro-slavery constitution. You're going to have the Topeka Constitution, which was an anti-slavery constitution. And it was like a race. Whose constitution can we get to Washington's first for approval by the government? Now, this is in 1856, so we're getting into the presidency of James Buchanan. Buchanan supported the Lecompton Constitution. So it looked like that was the one that was going to take off. You have intense debates on the floor of Congress. And, that's when Charles Sumner gives his speech, like the crimes against Kansas, and he's going to insult the uncle of Preston Brooks, which is going to lead to the caning of Charles Sumner by Preston Brooks, or it's also referred to as Bleeding Sumner. So all of that's going on. Now, I want to jump ahead to this next PowerPoint, and then I'll come back to this one. But the next thing that's going to happen is in 1857, the decision from Dred Scott versus Sanford is going to come out. And in Dred Scott v. Sanford, the Supreme Court of the United States is going to rule that African American slaves or African Americans in our country are not citizens. In fact, they are property. And in such, they have no rights. At the same time, you're going to see a little bit of judicial activism going on with this case when they rule that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional due to the fact that they said the federal government has no right to go in and regulate, slavery in different territories because that's interfering with property rights, and property rights are protected by the U.S. Constitution. So when we think about the Missouri Compromise, don't get confused. The Kansas-Nebraska Act basically nullified the Missouri Compromise. They said, we're just going to ignore it. We're going to kind of erase that 3630 line. But Dred Scott v. Sanford, that's going to declare it unconstitutional. And in a sense, what the Supreme Court is saying is every territory or every territorial decision that the Supreme Court has made regarding slavery is null and void at this point because they've never had a right to make those decisions. Now, all of this, and then you couple that with, the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, where both of these men are running for Senate in Illinois, and they have a series of debates, and what they're debating is this Free Soil platform. They're debating the validity of the Dred Scott decision, and we know that Douglas is going to end up winning this election, but Abraham Lincoln's going to draw a lot of national attention to himself. So then the next year we have John Brown's raid in 1859. This is when John Brown is going to go to Harper's Ferry in Virginia, hoping to start his own slave rebellion. He is going to raid the armory, try to steal weapons, and then his plan is to arm his own slave army, and they're going to march through the South and take over everything. Well, he's going to end up being captured, and he's going to end up being executed for his actions. But what this does is this sets the stage for this perception of this slave power conspiracy that's going through both the North and the South. The North views, what happened with Dred Scott and everything as a conspiracy for the South to spread slavery everywhere. Where all of a sudden we're going to see slavery spread all the way up into the northern states. It's going to spread all the way to the west to California. It's going to be everywhere. Not true. That was not what they were planning on doing, but that was what the North believed. At the same time, the South believes there's a slave power conspiracy led by people like John Brown and reminiscent of like the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, where Northerners are coming together and they're trying to end slavery through slave rebellions, that they're going to arm and they're going to, train or whatever they're going to do. They were going to amass a whole bunch of slave rebellions that are going to march through the South and destroy everything. Also not true, but these are the perceptions between the North and the South. And this has really been the issue from the beginning, honestly, is that these territories, the people in these territories just don't understand the lifestyle of the other territory. And, this comes to a fruition really after John Brown going into the election of 1860. Now, the question a lot of people says, where is all the presidencies? What are they doing during the 1850s? Because it doesn't seem like there's any real form of leadership at this time. Our three presidents of the 1850s is going to be Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. And I nicknamed them the three blind mice because in all honesty, these guys were worthless. They got nothing done. Several times on the board today, I wrote after certain things happened, no executive action, no executive action. They didn't do anything to stop that, division between our country from just growing wider and wider and wider. And they passed the buck so many times. You had Millard Fillmore, who just kind of, he signed the Compromise of 1850, and that was, his hill that he was going to die on, and the Fugitive Slave Law just kind of did him in. Then you had Franklin Pierce, who his whole, what he wanted to do was just please everybody. He was a yes man, but he was dealing with his own personal problems at the time with the death of his son and everything. And then finally, James Buchanan, who passed the buck of slavery, the decision of slavery, to the courts. He said it's a court decision. And then when Dred Scott v. Sanford came out, he kind of threw up his hands and says, well, there you go. That solves it right there. So these guys, the leadership we had in our country was just, like I said, it was worthless during this time. As we go into the 1860s, what's going to highlight the whole thing is going to be the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln's running on the Republican ticket, and what's really going to help his election is the Democrats are going to split. You're going to have the Northern Democrats supporting Stephen Douglas and the Southern Democrats supporting Breckinridge. And because they split the vote, Abraham Lincoln's going to win. Now, Abraham Lincoln's going to win this election without a single Southern electoral vote. And I don't know if you guys caught it in the video today. 81% voter turnout in this election. This election garnered so much attention because everyone really kind of knew what the result was going to be, especially if Lincoln wins. And sure enough, as soon as Lincoln is declared the winner, even before he becomes the president, South Carolina, along with 6 other states, secede from the Union. And they basically declare their independence from the United States. Now, throughout his presidency, Lincoln argued his goal is going to be to maintain the Union, to bring the Union back together. It was not he had, the first couple years he had no desire to emancipate the slaves. Now, he was a free soiler. He wanted to stop the spread of slavery, but he never campaigned on the idea that he was going to end slavery. But the South, because of that, slave power conspiracy and everything else, and, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they were convinced that Lincoln's goal was to end slavery. So, like I said, as soon as he gets elected, South Carolina, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, they're out. They're gone. After his inauguration, we'll see the other 4 states, which is Arkansas, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. They'll sprint out. And so we're going to have 11 states that secede from the Union. Now, the South, honestly, had the advantage going into this war. All they had to do was just stay home. And, just stick with their independence. There was one of your quiz questions that said the South didn't have to win this war. They just had to fight to a draw or tie. Because what basically they were saying is we're leaving, and, what the North had to decide to do and what Lincoln had to decide to do was decide if we were going to go after them and force them to come back in. And, of course, we know that's what happens. If it starts with the first firing, or the first shots that are fired are going to be at Fort Sumter. That's going to happen when Lincoln decides to resupply the troops at Fort Sumter. Well, that Fort Sumter is located in South Carolina. The Confederate states had declared that all U.S. federal property was now property of the Southern states and of the Confederacy. So basically, when Lincoln sends troops in to resupply, Jefferson Davis is going to see that as an act of war. They're going to fire on Fort Sumter, and that's going to be the start of the Civil War. A war that most people thought was only going to last a short period of time, but ends up lasting 4 years. Going into the Civil War, what do you need to know? Honestly, the big battle you really should know is the Battle of Antietam. We talked about Bull Run in class and stuff and everything, but really the battles you need to know is Antietam, because Antietam was the bloodiest single day of the war. 23,000 men were killed in that battle. And what Antietam is going to do, 2 things. Number 1, it's going to prevent any foreign intervention in the war, because prior to Antietam, England was considering coming in and helping the Confederacy. And I talked about how this is kind of like Saratoga during the American Revolution. After Saratoga, what we see happen is we see the French come in and join the Americans in the battle. But what Antietam does is it, rather than bringing in foreign help, it prevents foreign help from coming in, because with the, quote, victory that the North has with this battle, England decides just to completely stay out of it, and that's what they're going to do. The other thing Antietam is going to do is it's going to give Lincoln political leverage to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, again, we talked about how that is going to free the slaves in the Confederate States, in the seceding states. So the 11 states that seceded, that's the effectual territory of the Emancipation Proclamation. What it's not including, though, is the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, and somewhere at some point in the war, you're going to see West Virginia all come into being, and they're going to be one of the border states. And Lincoln does not include those states in the Emancipation Proclamation, so those people living in those states are permitted to keep their slaves. We remember how important the border states were to Lincoln due to their proximity. It provides a little bit more of a buffer between the north and the southern states. It also keeps at least part of Washington, D.C. in the north because Washington, D.C. sits right between Virginia and Maryland. And so we saw Lincoln take some pretty heavy-handed measures to make sure those states stayed in the Union. And we saw specifically in Maryland when he suspended habeas corpus, arrested all those, alleged Confederate sympathizers, and then keeps them in jail until they have the vote on whether or not to secede. And when they decide to stay, he goes, okay, you guys can go. The vote's over. He also is going to issue the first draft. He's going to draft 75,000 men into the Union Army, and he's going to institute a blockade around the South with his Navy. So, he's stepping over what a lot of people said, he made some unconstitutional moves during this time, but he also established the power of the presidency during war. And this is the first time we've seen that happen. And so we're going to see Lincoln is actually going to set some precedents for presidents for the future wars and stuff like that. So that's kind of, that's the beginning of the war. The next big battle I want you to know is Gettysburg. Gettysburg was a huge loss for the southern states, for Robert E. Lee. He was on a path of victory. I mean, he won at Chancellorsville, he won at Fredericksburg, and then he was going to go up and come down into Gettysburg with the idea of getting through Gettysburg and then coming down and taking Washington, D.C. He is going to lose at Gettysburg, and this is going to be the largest loss for the Confederacy. And like I mentioned before, the Battle of Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle, 3-day battle, July 1st to July 3rd of 1863. The Union is going to win this, and I think the most important thing that comes out of it is Lincoln is going to give the Gettysburg Address. And I think what we see in the Gettysburg Address in that very short speech is Lincoln's love and devotion to the Declaration of Independence and the idea of freedom that the founders had written about, and that it was our duty to go forth and try to obtain that freedom for everyone, and that's why we're fighting this war. Okay. The next big thing is going to be the Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864. That is going to coincide with the election of 1864. It's going to coincide with Sherman's March to the Sea, and William Tecumseh Sherman basically promised Lincoln a victory in the war. He said, I'm going to divide the South in half. I'm going to cut them in half, and that's going to lead to the victory. And Lincoln needed that victory because we've talked about it several times that Lincoln's popularity was dwindling. People in the North were war tired. They weren't trusting Lincoln to get them to the end of this war. And he's running against General George McClellan, and you remember correctly, George McClellan had been his commander twice, and twice Lincoln had fired him before he brought in Ulysses S. Grant. And McClellan was promising the people of the United States that he was just going to end the war. He said, I'm just going to take us back. We're going to let the South keep their slaves. I'm just going to bring everybody home. The war's going to be over. We're just going to hit reset, go back to peace. And for a lot of people in the North, that sounded good. I mean, 1.8 million people voted for McClellan. Lincoln squeaked by, honestly, with this victory. And at the same time, what's happening is his March to the Sea is very successful, so we're going to see that's going to lend to Lincoln's campaign and make it, he can say now, hey, listen, I got Sherman out here. He's having an effectual, he's being effectual in his March to the Sea. He's causing destruction to the South. We are winning now. You do not want to stop our progression. And if you're going to change the presidency, you are going to stop the progression of the Union Army, and you could, in fact, endanger the result that we are possibly going to get. We are nearing the end of the war. So by voting in McClellan, you're going to be possibly hurting the Union. So that argument's going to work, and Sherman's March to the Sea is going to work, and Lincoln will win the election of 1864. And then it was, going into it that, once Sherman reached Savannah, Georgia, it was just over for the South, and people knew it. The war officially comes to end on April 9th, 1865 at Appomattox. and that's going to be where Lee is going to surrender to Grant. And, you know, the country celebrates. It's about this time that Lincoln, or just before that, that Lincoln gives his second inaugural address. And, I mean, that was, I mentioned in class, and I know you guys read it, I just think that speech is one of the greatest speeches ever written. Because, you know, Lincoln had every right at this point to gloat. I mean, he had, you know, every right to have his moment, you know, mission accomplished, and we've done it, and we've you know, we're going to bring the Union back together, and look what we've done. But he didn't do that. He took a conciliatory tone, and he said, we have all contributed to this war. We have all contributed to the nearly 700,000 men who have died, and we cannot let them die in vain, and we must, you know, progress forward together. And that's when he gave, you know, the famous, you know, with malice towards none and charity for all. And, you know, he really showed the American people that, you know, that war, you know, how devastating this war had been, and how not only on the people of America, but on himself, but how he believed that the United States could rise from the ashes of this war. And so that's going to be, like I said, I think it's one of his greatest speeches that ever written, honestly. When we get past that, we go into, well, we just jumped way ahead. We unfortunately don't get to see Lincoln bring his dream to fruition, the dream of reunifying the country, because we know that on April 14th, he's going to be shot by John Wilkes Booth, and he's going to die the next morning. And so he's going to be assassinated, leading us to the presidency of Andrew Johnson. We come back here. Andrew Johnson, Democrat from Tennessee. He was brought on as Lincoln's vice president in the election of 1864. It was a split ticket. Remember, Lincoln was a Republican, Johnson's a Democrat. And, you know, Johnson's going to take Lincoln's plan for presidential reconstruction, and he's going to try to implement it. And we talked about this where, you know, the presidential reconstruction plan was going to be about a 10% plan. 10% of the Confederacy who had voted in the 1860 election, if they swore an allegiance to the United States and the state accepted emancipation, they would be allowed back into the Union. Well, the problem is that Johnson's trying to deal with a Republican Congress, and not just a Republican Congress, but a radical Republican Congress. And basically, they're going to sit in the seat of power because they have enough votes in the Congress to override any veto that Johnson tries to pass. Presidential Reconstruction is going to last about 3 years. After that, we're going to see Congressional Reconstruction, or it's also called Radical Reconstruction, take over. We're going to see situations in which the radical plan of Reconstruction is going to be, number one, setting up military districts in the South and put the South under martial law. Number two, they're going to need at least 50% swearing an oath to the Union, and not just swearing an oath to the Union, but swearing an oath that they have always been loyal to the Union and not, you know, one part of the Confederacy, you know, rebellion. And then they're going to get hold the South responsible for the debt that was accrued during the Civil War. And finally, they want to disenfranchise or take away the voting rights of all Confederate officials. And that's the difference between presidential and radical Reconstruction. It's the difference between hugs and slugs. And the radicals they're going to be able to do it. I mean, the Republicans are going to take control of Reconstruction. One thing they use in the South to help, you know, the slaves, because no one seemed to have a real plan for the 4.5 million slaves that have now been set free, is they're going to send the Freedmen's Bureau down, and they're going to work with the slaves, helping them get jobs, helping them get education, helping them get, you know, medical care, stuff like that. Although a lot of people are going to be very what's the word I'm looking for? They're going to resent the Freedmen's Bureau due to the fact that a lot of money is being filtered down to the southern states for Reconstruction, and it's their tax dollars going down. So you're going to see people in both the North and the South fight against the Freedmen's Bureau, and it's actually going to go away in 1872. Now, one thing I skipped over, and I definitely don't want to do this, is 3 key amendments were passed during Reconstruction: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is going to officially abolish slavery, and that's going to, make it, the freedom of the slaves legal now, because slavery is now an illegal practice in our country. 14th Amendment had several key points. The first one is going to grant birthright citizenship to anybody born in our country, and that's going to include I'll keep calling them slaves, but the freedmen. They will get their citizenship from that. There is also sections within the 14th Amendment that are pertaining to radical Reconstruction. We talked about how there's a section that talks about the South has to pay back all the debt. There's a section that talks about that all these Confederate officials that will be disenfranchised, they can apply for a pardon. Now, just backtracking a little bit, Johnson offered pardons to Confederate officials, but they had to go through him. They had to come ask him for the pardon. Well, Congress is now going to say you can apply for a pardon, but you have to come through Congress, and you need a 2/3 majority vote before you can be, re-enfranchised into the country. So that was in there too. And I'm drawing a blank on what the other section was, but we talked about the different sections. Everything within the 14th Amendment, it's either to give citizenship to the freedmen or punish the South. And that's really what radical Reconstruction was all about. It was about punishing the South, waving the bloody shirt and saying, you started this war, you lost the war, now you pay for the war. Take responsibility for it. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, what that's going to do is that's going to give the right to vote to African American males. One thing I want to touch on one more time, I know I keep saying it, but I wanted to sink in. There were a lot of women who were not happy with the fact that they were left out of the 15th Amendment. And so you're going to see them drifting away from the civil rights movement and all that other stuff, because they really felt like they got shortchanged with the Reconstruction Amendments. Okay, so I've said it a lot, so hopefully it's sunk in. 1870s, we're going to see the end of Johnson's presidency, and we're going to see the introduction of the presidency of Andrew Grant. All we covered with Grant's administration was his, what's going on with Reconstruction in the South. He was a big supporter of radical Reconstruction, so you're going to see the Congress and the executive branch come together again. We're going to see the rise of the KKK in the South. The Congress is going to pass, and I did not talk about this in class, and I don't think you're going to need it. You're not going to need it for the test, but I want you to hear about it. They're going to pass the Enforcement Acts, and these are laws that are made to basically, combat the KKK in the South. Okay. So these enforcement acts make it illegal to interfere with anyone's right to vote, and that's one thing the KKK tried to do. Also made the enforcement acts gave the courts the power to indict members of the Klan in the South as well. We're going to see the violence in the KKK decline around 1870, 1872, but they never really go away. So just keep that in mind. The big thing in the South during this time, we talked about carpetbaggers, we talked about scalawags, we talked about the Republican coalition that was made up of those two groups along with the freedmen. You see a time period where you have a Republican control of the South, but that's going to change in about 1874. 1874, we're going to see a shift in the Congress. We're going to see in the House of Representatives control going from the Republicans to the Democrats. Several reasons why Americans start voting Democrat. Number one is the economy. The economy in the United States has gotten weak. We have a panic in 1873 that's going to cause the value of the dollar to drop. We're going to go through several years of economic depression. And so a lot of people are hurting in the country, and of course they blame government. And whenever there's an economic downturn, you normally see what mirrors that is a change in political party of power in Washington, D.C. They were tired of Reconstruction. That was another cause. And basically everyone just wanted this to be over. So you're going to see a shift to, a Democrat control of the House of Representatives, and that's going to lead to what's known as the Solid South. And we get to the election of 1876, And in the election of 1876, we're going to see a solid South go solid Democrat. I showed you that map. And the South is going to remain solidly Democratic until the 1960s. And that all starts right here. The official end of, I'm going to skip over that, the official end of the Reconstruction period is going to be the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, nicknamed Rutherfraud. This was from the Compromise of 1877. You had a situation in which Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, had he was one electoral vote shy of winning the presidency. Yet there were 3 states that were being they were arguing over who had the power. You had Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. These 3 states had sent both Republicans and Democrats to the Electoral College, and no one knew who had the right to vote. If the Democrats got the vote, Tilden's going to win the election. If the Republicans get the vote, Hayes is going to win the election. And here's what it boils down to. Hayes promised to, in Reconstruction, remove the military from the South if those votes for those 3 states came to him. And that's basically what happened. And so for I think the second time in history, we're going to see a president be elected who did not get the popular vote, yet he will win the Electoral College. However, there was some backroom deals due to that, and that's why his nickname was Rutherfraud B. Hayes. Okay, and that is what marks the official end of the Reconstruction and the end of this period that we've been studying. So, wow, I got through that in 53 minutes. That's a lot faster than I thought it was going to be. So my question now is, what questions do you guys have? I'll be happy to sit here for a few minutes and answer any questions you might have regarding the coming of the test tomorrow. Like I said, a lot of information that has to be covered. The question, just to let you know, it's a 42 multiple choice question, all stimulus-based multiple choice. I had a couple people who took the test early. They were easily able to get through the test in the allotted time. So I don't want you guys to worry about that. Remember, we don't have flex or anything tomorrow, so you're going to have the full 50 minutes for class. So I think you'll be fine with time. But just what I'm wondering, do you guys have any questions at all that I can answer? I had a couple come up already, and I think I answered those. But so you tell me, what do you guys have? And I'll wait here a few minutes. Like I said, it goes everywhere from the Reform Movement, Second Great Awakening, leading into the road to Civil War. The 1850s is very important and everything that happened there. When we get into the Civil War, the big battles, Antietam, Gettysburg, Appomattox. There is no short answer on this one. It's just 42 multiple choice questions. Just to, we want to get you guys, we want to start kind of increasing the number and have you guys, really start to work with the time allotted that you'll have. So you'll have 50 minutes to do 42 questions. I think it'll be plenty of time. I think most of you guys have been doing really well with time, so I'm not too concerned about that. So what else? Any other questions? Is there anything about the Know Nothing Party or the Liberty Party? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a specific question about them. I would just, make sure you are basically familiar with the Know Nothing Party, that they were a nativist party. They were against immigration, specifically the Irish and the Germans coming in. So you just be familiar with their platform, and I think you'll be fine with that. Megan's asking, what do we need to know about the Transcendentalist movement or any reform groups? Basically, like I said earlier, the Transcendentalist movement worked alongside with the Second Great Awakening, and that's going to lead to reform because it was Transcendentalism that said one person, can make a difference. Second Great Awakening gave us this idea to improve the morality of society. So, the different reform groups that I've already talked about, the abolition group, the temperance movement, the women's suffrage movement, just be familiar with some of the names like Dorothea Dix with prison reform and mental reform. The ladies with the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, the Grimke sisters, and the Grimke sisters also kind of tied to the abolition movement. So I don't, you don't have to get in depth, but definitely have a working knowledge of those, those 3 or 4 major reform movements and who their leaders are. You don't need to get into the weeds of every single member, but the leadership is kind of important. The Freedmen's Bureau, that's the one we talked about, that the Freedmen's Bureau went down. They were established to go down and help the freedmen once they got their freedom from slavery, so they're going to go down and they're going to be helping and working with the former slaves, giving them education, helping them find jobs, maybe giving them medical care. Well, obviously the South is going to oppose it due to the the fact that a lot of attention is given to these former slaves, and they're also dealing with the destruction of their society and everything. The North is going to be opposed to it just because of the cost. They're going to see a lot of money go down to the Freedmen's Bureau. They're going to see a lot of that's when the carpetbaggers are getting jobs in the governments and stuff like that, and they're seeing corruption and they're seeing a lot of money, and they're going through their own economic challenges, and they don't want to pay for that. They don't they're wondering why all these freedmen are kind of getting what they have viewed as a free ride. And they're working to give them that ride. So the Northerners didn't like it because, like I told you, the Civil War didn't end racism. It probably increased racism in our country. And so the Northerners are going to be just as upset about the freedmen getting all these benefits, that they're not seeing themselves. So that's why they were opposed to it. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, Jessica, primarily debated the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision, also the Free Soil movement. So that was the crux of their debates, because that was the hot debate during this time. Taney and the Supreme Court had just basically ruled that slaves were property. It could go anywhere in the United States. So they're debating the validity of this ruling and what effect that might have on our country. So that's what the main idea of those debates were. Okay. What other questions? I'm hoping I'm answering your questions. If I'm not answering them, just shoot me a couple question marks or something next to your name, and I can try to basically try to re-explain it. So, what else do you guys got? I was about to say I'm here all night, but I'm not here all night. I'm here for about another 5 minutes at the most. I don't know if you can tell by looking at me, I'm getting really tired. Let's see. Were there any wars between? No. Sean, they just basically negotiated. Now Polk threatened war, and maybe that's why Great Britain negotiated more. But basically, I think it was a threat in verbiage only. I don't know that Polk actually would have gone to war over the Oregon Territory. I would hope not, but that was his campaign promise. But yeah, no, England Great Britain and the United States were able to negotiate, and that's when they set the line at the 49th parallel, which is the same border that we have today. So, one thing I didn't mention, Manifest Destiny. Familiarize yourself with Manifest Destiny and what spurred it. You don't have to, someone was asking me today about the trails and stuff. I'm not so concerned about that, but what were the push-pull factors of Manifest Destiny? Obviously, some of the pull factors would be, the California gold rush and the free land and stuff like that. And the push factors were, it could be the growing tension, or just all sorts of different things. But just be familiar with Manifest Destiny and the high points of it when it was at its height and stuff like that. What did Pierce and Buchanan do that was important under their presidency? Nothing. That's the big thing. They did nothing. They responded to things, but under Pierce is when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, and with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that led to Bleeding Kansas, and Pierce did nothing with what was going on in Kansas. I mean, you got to think about it. You literally had a war going on in a U.S. territory between American citizens, and the President of the United States did nothing to respond to that. And then Buchanan, when he came in, when the question was thrown at him, what are you going to do about slavery? He's like, hey, it's not my decision. It's something for the courts to decide. So he didn't do anything either. So there's nothing major you have to remember about those two accomplishing during their presidency. So Can you tell how I feel about the presidents during the 1850s? I mean, like I said, 3 blind mice. They whatever, you know. Okay. Anything else? Good questions, though. Some water. All right. Not seeing anything. It's almost time to get the little boy over here to say hello. He's been very good tonight. He's actually knows I'm talking about him. He's working his way over here. So, all right, guys, I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm going to try to get him up here. Come here. Can you get up here? Want a treat? Oh, he's right here with his ball. Get up here. Come here. Come here, buddy. Get up here. Oh, come on. Oh, ready? Oh. There he is. Here comes Flynn. Here he is. Here you go. Say hello. He's got his ball. He wants to play. Yes. Say hello, Flynn. All right. Now, Flynn's going to wish you good luck. I'm going to wish you good luck. You guys are going to do a great job tomorrow. If you have any questions, I did not erase my board after 8th period today, so if you want to come in and take a look at it tonight, you are welcome, or not tonight, I'm sorry, tomorrow morning, you are more than welcome. And again, if you have any questions, you can come see me tomorrow morning, but that's about it. I'm going to wrap it up for now, say goodnight, and hope you guys have a great evening. All right, Flynn and I, we're calling it a night. Bye-bye.